Okay, so this whole deep dive thing, it all started because of something that happened to me a while back. It's really stuck with me. Years ago, I was just kind of wandering the streets of Athens and came across this wall completely covered in graffiti, like stark white, but spray painted in huge black letters. Tourists go home. I don't know, that was kind of jarring to see.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
And it seems like we're seeing more and more of that kind of sentiment these days, don't you think?
Right,
All
yeah.
those news stories about protests against tourists in Barcelona or Venice deciding to charge day trippers a fee to even enter the city, it really makes you stop and think, what's driving all this growing resentment toward visitors?
I mean, it's a question a lot of us are thinking about, especially if we like to travel and see the world.
Definitely.
Hmm.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today, right here, right now.
Yeah.
Why is there this rise in animosity towards tourists, and maybe more importantly for all of us? How can we travel in a way that's positive for everyone involved, for ourselves and the places we're visiting?
That's the goal, right?
Absolutely. And we've got some really interesting material to work with for this deep dive. There's a firsthand account from somebody who experienced this anti-tourism sentiment head on, plus some really practical advice from experts on how to be a better traveler. So what we're going to do is take all of that and try to boil it down to some actionable advice that all of us can use.
Sounds good to me.
One thing that jumped out at me right away, even before we got into the research,
Yeah.
it seems like even though all the news headlines might make it look like everyone hates tourists now, it's not quite as simple as that, is it?
Yeah, it's more nuanced than that. The sources we found actually suggest that it's not necessarily about hating all tourists, which I think
Why?
is an important distinction.
Totally. So let's start by getting some context for this whole idea of anti-tourism sentiment. Like those examples we just mentioned, the protests in Barcelona, that new fee in Venice, those are pretty clear signs that some places are feeling overwhelmed, right? And it's not just a feeling, is it? I mean, we found this really interesting statistic from a radical storage survey. Get this. Over half of all travelers actually admit to acting completely different when they're on vacation, sometimes doing things they'd never do back home.
Wow, over half. That's a lot. I mean, it kind of shows how travel can change people's behavior, doesn't it? Being away from your normal surroundings. The survey actually listed some pretty specific examples too, like people messing with historical artifacts, trespassing, or just generally not caring about local customs.
Yeah, like they're not even trying to blend in.
It's not just a few isolated cases. It seems like it's pretty widespread.
Oh, and we've got some even more concrete examples too, like this one etiquette expert, Adeodata Sink. She had some pretty straight talk about how American tourists in particular are often seen as, quote, loud and demanding.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And this article about Dublin, which I used to live in, by the way, it mentions how big groups of tourists, especially Americans, Germans, and Brazilians, would often get way too drunk and rowdy in the Temple Bar area,
Hmm.
basically causing a scene. It kind of paints a picture, right?
Definitely. It really highlights the specific behaviors that are feeding into this negative perception of tourists. It's not just about the number of visitors, it's about how some of them are acting.
Okay, but here's the good news. You ready for this? It's not all doom and gloom. Our research also showed something really important. Locals don't hate all tourists. It's crucial to remember that, as you're planning your next trip.
Yeah, totally. I mean, who are these bad tourists everyone's complaining about?
Right, like who are they actually talking about? Don Jones from Andrew Harper, which is like a high-end travel club, had some thoughts on that. He basically said that when people complain about bad tourists, they're often talking about two specific groups. The first one was those super rowdy bachelor and bachelorette parties where it's all about drinking as much as possible.
Yeah, okay, I've definitely seen those groups around. They can be hard to miss.
They're loud, they're often kind of obnoxious, not really thinking about the people around them. And then the second group you mentioned was Instagrammers.
Ah, yes. The ones who are all about getting that perfect picture for social media.
Exactly. And they're often so focused on getting the shot that they forget about being polite. Like pushing people out of the way or even trespassing on private property just to get a better angle.
Yeah.
So if that doesn't sound like you, if you're not part of those crazy party groups and you're not obsessed with getting the perfect Instagram photo, then guess what? You're already doing better than a lot of people.
Hmm.
But if any of that does sound a little too familiar, well, the advice is pretty simple.
What's that?
Maybe try taking it easy on the alcohol when you're traveling. Or even better, skip it altogether. And Honestly, like one of the experts said, nobody cares about your Instagram feed as much as you do. So maybe put the phone down once in a while and actually enjoy where you are.
I love that. It's so true. Instead of trying to show off on social media, just be present in the moment.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about some of the problems and the kinds of tourists who might be causing them. But what about solutions? What can we do to be better travelers?
Well, our sources had some really great advice on that. The first thing that stood out to me was this idea of being mindful of where you're going,
Hmm.
like choosing destinations where tourists are actually appreciated.
Right, and that actually ties into this bigger trend that Burkita Bradford from North Carolina Central University was talking about. She said that more and more people are choosing where to travel based on their values,
Hmm.
whether that's political, social, or cultural.
So basically, if you get the feeling that a certain place is sending out a tourists not welcome vibe, maybe it's better to just go somewhere else. I mean, there are so many amazing places to see in the world. Why not spend your time and money in a place where you're actually going to feel welcome?
Makes sense to me. No need to force yourself into a situation where you might feel uncomfortable. Exactly.
Mm.
Okay, next piece of advice, and this is a big one. Show respect. And that really connects to this whole concept of sustainable tourism that Nicole Cueto from Fora Travel was talking about.
Ah, yes, sustainable tourism.
It can sound kind of vague, but it basically means being a responsible traveler.
Right.
And that boils down to some pretty concrete things, like minimizing your impact on the environment,
Okay.
supporting local businesses that are environmentally friendly, reducing waste, conserving water, being respectful of wildlife. It all adds up.
It really does. Every little bit helps.
So moving on from respecting the environment to respecting local customs. Nick Layton, he's an etiquette expert and the host of a podcast called Were You Raised by Wolves? He had a great point about this. He said that being genuinely interested in the local culture helps you avoid accidentally offending people, and it also makes people like you more.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Showing that you care about their culture.
And it's really not that hard to do. Just take a little time to do some research before your trip. Like,
Yeah.
what are the typical greetings? What are some basic things you could do to be polite? Are there any dress codes, especially for religious places? Just showing that you've made an effort to understand and respect their way of life can make a huge difference in how you're received.
Like you're actually treating their country like a place where people live, not just a tourist attraction.
Right. And then there's this next piece of advice. It might seem obvious, but it's super important. Pack your patience and be kind.
Good advice for life in general, really.
Totally. Jamila Musayeva, she's an etiquette coach, she really emphasized this. She said you should treat locals with the same kindness and courtesy that you'd expect from people back home. And think about it. Travel can be stressful. Flights get delayed. Sometimes restaurants get your order wrong. It's how you react in those moments that really matters.
So true.
If you can stay calm and handle things gracefully, it not only makes your own trip better, but it also makes a good impression on the people you meet.
Nobody wants to deal with a grumpy, impatient tourist.
Right. A little bit of understanding and a smile can go a long way.
It really can.
Now, it's important to remember that it's not all on the traveler. Destinations themselves are also trying to figure out ways to deal with this whole tourism problem.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They're part of the solution, too.
One of the things we found was about this campaign in Idaho. It's called Travel with Care, and they started it back in 2020.
Interesting. Tell me more about it.
So basically, it has three main parts. Caring for the state, which is all about protecting the environment. Caring for others, which is encouraging tourists to be more mindful of the people around them. And caring for yourself, which is all about staying safe while you're traveling.
I like that. It's a very well-rounded approach to responsible tourism.
And even though they don't have hard data to prove it's been successful, the anecdotal evidence is pretty positive. They haven't seen an increase in anti-tourist graffiti, and there hasn't been any talk about adding extra taxes for tourists. It kind of shows that when a place actively promotes responsible tourism, it can really improve the relationship between visitors and locals.
Yeah, it's like they're setting the tone, right? Letting people know what kind of behavior they expect.
Exactly. And now for maybe the most important piece of advice when it comes to avoiding that whole anti-tourism thing, try to avoid the biggest crowds. James Thornton, the CEO of Intrepid Travel, had some pretty mind-blowing statistics about this.
Oh, okay, I'm curious.
He said that, get this, a whopping 80% of tourists only visit about 10% of the world's tourist destinations. So basically, everybody's crowding into the same few places.
Wow. I mean, that explains a lot, doesn't it? No wonder some of those places are feeling overwhelmed.
Right. And his advice is basically, go against the flow. Try going to some of those less popular, less crowded places.
Yeah.
He talked about how there are all these amazing alternative destinations out there that offer just as much as the famous spots, but without the hordes of people.
Makes a lot of sense.
Now, this doesn't mean you have to completely cross those iconic places off your list, like Venice, Rome, Paris.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to miss those.
But the trick is being strategic about when and how you visit those places.
Right.
Think about going during the shoulder seasons or even the off-season when there are naturally fewer tourists around.
Smart.
And even if you do go during peak season, try to avoid the most popular times at those big attractions. Even just a small shift in your timing can make a big difference in your experience, and it takes some of the pressure off the locals.
It's all about being mindful, isn't it?
Totally. And it's not just about when you visit, but also how you experience a place. Thomas Swick, an author who's written a lot about travel, had this really great piece of advice. Show an interest in the people. He suggests getting away from the main tourist traps and spending some time in local neighborhoods, just observing everyday life.
I love that. It's about getting a more authentic feel for a place.
And when you venture off the beaten path like that, you're more likely to have genuine interactions with local people. And like Swick said, instead of being met with negativity, you might even find yourself invited for a coffee or a conversation.
That's what it's all about.
That's the kind of travel experience that sticks with you, right? That feeling of real connection. So to sum it all up for our listeners out there, the main takeaways from this deep dive are pretty clear. First, be really aware of how your behavior affects the people around you. Don't get wasted in public, and try not to be too intrusive with your photography. Second, be respectful of the environment and local customs. A little bit of research goes a long way. And finally, think about venturing off the beaten path. There's a whole world of incredible experiences waiting to be discovered beyond the tourist hotspots.
It's about being a more conscious, considerate traveler.
It is. And if we can all do that, not only will we have better travel experiences ourselves, but we'll also be helping to create a more positive, sustainable relationship between tourists and the communities that welcome them. It's a win-win for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, how do our travel choices reflect our values as global citizens? And how can we change our perspective to have more authentic, more rewarding travel experiences in the future?
Good question.
I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Think back to a time you saw a tourist being really awesome, or maybe not so awesome. What made the difference? It's something to ponder as you plan your next adventure. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a great conversation.
Definitely. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.
Cheers.